everybody. Welcome to this BPF Futures webinar on furloughing. I'm Julie Dayton, Head of Communications at Grainger, and I'll be the chair for this session. I'm joined by a great panel comprising Krista Poppett, Senior Director of HR at Turley.
Hello.
Rachel Kelly, Assistant Director of Finance at the BPF.
Hello.
And Harvin Chauhan, Surveyor at CBRE and Chair of the BPF Futures Advisory Board. This bite-sized webinar aims to explore furlough in a little bit more detail, looking at the background to the scheme, what it means, personal experience of being furloughed, and business recovery from furlough. If you've got any questions, please use the Q&A tool on Zoom and we'll try to answer those at the end. As it's a bite-sized session, we're going to jump straight into the questions and a little bit on the background. So Rachel, in terms of background, what have been the key drivers for businesses within the property sector to furlough staff?
The government's intention with the furlough scheme was to make sure that as many businesses could keep their staff employed as possible, so that whenever the restrictions are released or lifted, then businesses are ready to bounce back and the economy is ready to bounce back with as little kind of unemployment as possible. And I suppose it's also allowed some employers some breathing space to think about if they do need to do some restructuring in the future. It's allowing them not to make any rash decisions until we get a bit more information, hopefully, in terms of how long these restrictions might be in place. And in the property sector, it's been, I mean, as you mentioned, about a quarter of our workforce have taken up this furlough scheme. And so in the property sector as well, it's been rife, although it's varied depending on what sector you're in. One of the sectors that has made significant use of it is the construction sector. And I suppose that's, I guess, mostly because as like other industries where you can't work from home, you have no choice but to not work, and so the furlough scheme is particularly helpful there. So even within the construction sector, there's a larger skew towards those that are in manufacturing or contractors. The percentage of people using furlough there are kind of greater than 60%, but it's less if you're probably in a sector that can work from home more, so in an advisory role. And so similarly, within the construction sector, it's kind of equally as varied, and depending on how much your revenues have been impacted will depend on how much you'll need to make use of the furlough scheme, and depending on how much people can work from home or not. Yeah, and clearly, presumably within retail, leisure and hospitality, the rates will be the highest.
Yeah, absolutely. Krista, as a HR professional, have you ever experienced anything like this?
No, I haven't, and I don't think anybody else that I have spoken to has either. I was working through the last recession, but I haven't experienced anything of this complexity and magnitude before. And, you know, as the PM said yesterday in the plan for recovery, this is one of the biggest international challenges that has been faced for a generation. And I think we can all appreciate that BPF Future members certainly have not been through anything like this or even through the recession before this. So I think it must be really tough, you know, emotionally and sort of practically to adjust to this whole situation, together with the health concerns that are going on and the level of anxiety around that.
Yeah, absolutely. Harvin, do we know how many BPF Futures members have been affected by the pandemic and furloughing of staff?
A large majority of probably future members fall into the category that would have been furloughed, unfortunately. But that kind of varies, as Rachel mentioned, kind of from sector to sector and businesses to businesses. You know, so I was speaking with a colleague this morning who, you know, their company have taken a slightly different approach, albeit, you know, he is a junior professional. So I think the numbers are changing, and from what I'm hearing, I think some companies are also adjusting the rates at which they're furloughing. So
right.
I think people often think that perhaps you're only on furlough kind of as of perhaps it started a month ago, but actually some companies are still furloughing individuals as we speak.
In the next part of the webinar, we're going to look at what it means to be furloughed. Starting with you, Krista, could you briefly describe the support offered by this job retention scheme?
Yeah, the support offered by the job retention scheme is one of financial support. So it enables employers who have been severely impacted by coronavirus to pay 80% of their employees' wages, salaries, currently until the end of June, although there's expected to be an update today from the Chancellor. So it's one of financial support. It's then up to employers to ensure that they support their employees through the furlough period. Keeping in touch in terms of communication is really important. You know, things like training and learning and development, they can all happen at the same time, but apprentices, fixed term contracts, student contracts, they're all covered by the furlough scheme, and employers can choose whether to top up the pay for people. Clearly that's an affordability point down to each individual employer, but there's other aspects in terms of, you know, well-being and support that employers need to be mindful of.
Yeah, because that's what I was going to ask. Just presumably companies have their own policies, but what can and can't a person do if they've been furloughed?
Starting with what people can't do, they're not allowed to work whilst they're on furlough, and HMRC have been really strict on that point, because employers in future could well be audited to make sure that they haven't you know, misused the scheme and that it's been applied appropriately. So first of all, not working, but then and you can't generate revenue or income for your employer. So that's really clear in the guidance. What you can do on a more positive note is that you can keep in touch regularly, keep in touch in terms of a social capacity, which again is really important for people's connection and well-being. And you can undertake actually other employment. So you could do charity work, or you could, with your employer's permission, you'd need to check your employment contracts first, but ensuring that you ask to be able to undertake others. So we've had examples where people have asked to help as delivery drivers or help out charity work. So keeping yourself busy during the furlough period is really important. And I've spoken to many of our co-owners about what they're up to. They're learning new languages, they're completing APC, they're you know, spending time doing other activities that and hobbies that they might not have otherwise done. So I think keeping active, looking after your mental and physical well-being is really important.
And what is the current timescale for furloughing?
Yeah, so the current timescale is that you can be furloughed, or you have to be furloughed for a minimum of 3 weeks. You could then come back and rotate with others, but obviously it's dependent on what the employer's needs are and what work is available to be done. So it's a minimum of 3 weeks currently to the end of June, which was extended from the 31st of May. And then, as I mentioned, the Chancellor is updating people today. It's anticipated that the scheme may be extended until the end of September, but on a reduced support rate. So they're looking to sort of, in their words, wean companies off of and not sort of step off a cliff edge, putting companies and people in difficult situations and increased job losses. So we'll keep a really close eye on what's happening today with the announcement. And it's important then that employers use that in terms of their scenario planning moving forwards.
Before this, I'd never even heard of the word furlough, and here I am currently, you know, as part of the scheme. So yeah, I think initially it was actually, what does this mean exactly for me? It was kind of unclear at the stage, kind of what I can and cannot do. But also I think it'd be fair to say that I think everyone was quite worried or uncertain about, you know, obviously the scheme is there for that you do eventually resume back into work, but I think there's always that kind of shadow of doubt in it at the back of everyone's mind that, you know, is this another form of redundancy? And there is always that worry. And I think, you know, I'd say it's really important for employers to kind of and to reassure individuals that that's not what it is there, you know, and it is there. It is a support mechanism for businesses during this kind of difficult time. But yeah, it's kind of, those nerves have calmed down as the weeks have gone on now, I'd say.
How are you keeping yourself busy?
It's been a mixture of new hobbies. So I've started to like pick up some new languages. I've downloaded Duolingo on the phone. Bizarrely, I've started cooking as well. So kind of doing a lot of YouTube dishes. And then a mixture of actually kind of helping up around the house a lot more. So I've tidied up the garden, as well as I think, you know, trying to get out as much as, well, once a day, but as much as reasonably possible. It kind of, I think I try and set myself something to do each day. And I think as long as you've got something to kind of wake up and do, I think that's helped me stay sane, as it were. And it's kind of helped me keep occupied, as well as kind of, as Krista mentioned, keeping in contact with team members, whether that's a FaceTime call or just picking up the call with them, and just touching base with various members of the team and just staying connected with them.
Do you have any advice for anybody else that may be in the same situation as you at the moment?
I think my best piece of advice would be is actually, I've personally have felt the connecting with your team and making sure you stay connected. For me, it's been really helpful. I think it's, you know, it's very easy you could easily go a day, a week without speaking to someone in your team, and all of a sudden you feel pretty quite distant as to what's going on at work. So yeah, my top tip would be just to really encourage anyone listening to just, if you are on furlough, to continue speaking with your team members, and actually just be really open and honest about how you are feeling. You know, as we touched on earlier, you know, there is the issue of mental health and the impacts that, you know, perhaps being alone could have. Yeah, and actually just be honest with your team members if you are having any issues or any queries that you've got. You know, no question is a silly question during this kind of unprecedented time. So just definitely raise them with your employer, and I'm sure there'll be a resolution.
Brilliant. Thank you. Krista, from your perspective in HR, do you have any advice for people who have been furloughed and are maybe worried about their future?
I think it's very difficult at the moment to provide any level of certainty, and I think people really appreciate that. And you know, the support mechanisms that have been put in place for businesses are there to sort of support us through this challenging time. And I think depending on what advisors you speak to, the advice is different in terms of when the economy will bounce back. On you know, in terms of the advice I'd give people is to know that, you know, the market will bounce back. We will get through it. It's just a case of when that is going to happen, and how we get there. But I you know, say keep learning, continuous professional development. You might have a little bit of webinar fatigue, so pick wisely which ones to join, you know, and keep yourself well. As Harvin said, that's so important, being open about how you feel, using the support mechanisms that are available to you. The employee assistance program, for example, I'm sure many employers have that, which is free counselling and support for yourselves and often your family members in your household. Be collaborative with your employer, so be flexible, be supportive, communicate and talk and try and work things out, because they will have your best interests at heart, as well as trying to get the business through a really tough time. And see it as an opportunity. You know, we're all learning new ways of doing things, smarter ways of working, and I really think that will impact on the way that we work with each other and our clients in the future.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think people have just adapted and recognizing there are lots of different ways of doing so many things, and things that we didn't think were possible before can actually be possible. So yeah. We're going to look now at recovery from furlough and the likely challenges that business will have in bringing people out of furlough. So Rachel, from your perspective, what do you think the potential issues are facing businesses who have furloughed employees?
Well, I think that one of the issues for all businesses is that they just don't know how long these restrictions will be in place, how the economy is going to change, how the way we live our lives is going to change. And so it's difficult to know what kind of resources your businesses are going to need in the future. So I guess one of the big challenges is businesses need to start making some decisions about, might need to make some decisions about restructuring. But in terms of actually bringing people back to work, which is hopefully the ideal, one of the big challenges with the furlough scheme is that it's very black and white. You either have to work or you have to not work. And actually, in terms of the kinds of businesses that are going to be coming back, and actually the need for perhaps a more gradual, phased approach to coming back, it might be that the furlough scheme itself is not actually appropriate for that, and we need some other kind of job support mechanism that would, say, allow people to come back part-time, or 2 or 3 days a week, or something like that, to build up. Because I guess if we think about the likes of retail or hospitality especially, I think that most people are expecting those businesses to be coming back at a reduced capacity.
Yeah.
So they'll be serving, fewer tables, or, fewer clients. And so that might mean that businesses won't need quite so many staff all at once for the foreseeable future. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges, and certainly something that we're pushing for is some more phased support for people, bringing people back to work gradually.
And Krista talked earlier about sort of the announcement expected today. Do you think we're likely to see anything more from that today? Yeah,
I mean, sure. It's unfortunate that the timing of this webinar means that we don't know exactly what the Chancellor is going to be announcing, but it will be very difficult to row back from this level of support. A quarter of the workforce are dependent on it at the moment. So it's going to be a lot harder to take it back than it was to bring it in. Having said that, it's costing huge amounts of money, and so the government need to be balancing the cost of it with the reliance that a lot of people have on it. And I think, as Krista says, it could be that they start to drop down to something like 80% to 60% to lower amounts to kind of wean companies off of it. Or it could be some sectors are saying that actually the government should be looking at this in a more sectoral way and maintaining that support for those sectors that are going to be hardest hit for the longest. Leisure, aviation, who many think they're not really going to be up and running at least even till the end of the year, so some support might be more needed for those sectors for longer. But we will have to wait a few more hours and see what the Chancellor says.
By this evening we'll know more. Again, I appreciate there is no crystal ball here, but do you have any idea, Rachel, when things might improve for the property industry?
Again, it's very difficult, but I mean, the Prime Minister's announcement on Sunday, over the last couple of days, clearly show an ambition and an intent to get the economy back and running, or back to some kind of normality. But I think we all know that that's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be quick, and some sectors are going to be significantly impacted for some time. But I think that will vary. I think some businesses will be able to adapt more quickly, put in safety measures within their normal working environment, and actually be able to carry on going more as normal than others. And some people can work from home very easily. But I do think that there are sectors like retail, like hospitality, like leisure, where it's going to be really difficult to get up to anything like the same capacity as normal. And there might even be different variances depending on whether you're kind of more urban and more space restricted, say in a cafe, or whether you're more rural and have more space or more outside space, and you're able to space tables further apart. So there's going to be differences, and lots of businesses will have to make lots of decisions about exactly how they can get back and at what capacity. And unfortunately, I suspect there'll be some businesses where it just doesn't make sense for them to come back at limited capacity, and that will be I guess that's where you do need the likes of the furlough scheme, or even some kind of support with your fixed costs from government. If there's no point for you to come back at limited capacity, I think it would make sense for the government to try and encourage those businesses to still try and come back a little bit.
Yeah. And Krista, I guess thinking about a sort of phased approach back and a sort of return to normality, with your HR hat on, how can business approach to growth of staff have been followed?
Yeah, so reintegrating people back into the workplace, I think as Rachel says, it will vary depending on the type of business that you are and the timing of when you're actually going back to work. I think everybody's experiences of this pandemic has been different, and we need to appreciate that as employers. So some people will have been affected directly and sadly lost loved ones or relatives and friends through this. And then there are the sort of work challenges in terms of some people have carried on working through, really working sort of all hours to keep things going, and then other people have kindly offered themselves to be furloughed or been asked to furlough to help the company get through and get the funding to keep going. So I think there's a whole lot of different experiences that will have been going on, and people's own home environments are very, very different. So companies will need to continue to foster an inclusive environment, and I think there's been a lot of really good work on inclusion and diversity in the industry over the past few years. So we need to keep that work going, and managers will need to be sensitive to the needs and concerns of each of their team members and making sure they understand what is going on with each person, because it won't be one size fits all. Some people will be desperate to get back to a physical location because perhaps of their home circumstances. Others will be very fearful of public transport coming into the office and everything else. So I think it's important that it's dealt with in terms of thinking it through in that way logically and thinking through each individual circumstance. It's clear we'll be working from home if you can for some time yet. So if the furlough scheme ends and employers are still able to work at home, which I imagine will happen, then integrating people back into the workplace virtually has its own challenges, just like sort of managing remote teams. So we need to make sure that we're really communicating very well, that managers have the information they need and the skills that they need to ensure that people are reintegrated. I think all colleagues play their part in making sure people feel included and that they can return to a safe environment and a welcoming environment.
I think you're right in terms of when you say that there's no one size fits all to this. It's just so unique to each individual circumstances, isn't it? So
it is, yes.
Personalisation required.
Yes, yeah.
Harvin, from your perspective, have you thought about what happens after your period of furlough?
Yeah, so we're currently actually going through that right now in terms of having the conversations with kind of team heads as to what the decision is kind of internally from the business. So currently I'm on furlough until the 31st of May, but in lieu of the government scheme having been extended to June and potentially September, and we'll hear later on today. So that's currently the process at the moment, as understanding what's going to happen. But I totally agree that whenever people are phased back into work, I think it definitely won't be the same. And actually, from an advisory perspective, actually having been out of the market for what is now two months, actually there'll be a phase of actually understanding what the market is doing and what advice we can and can't be giving to clients. The advice perhaps we were giving in January is going to be completely different to what we can be giving now. So actually, I'd say from anyone in an advisory role, there'll probably be a phase of actually just learning as to what the next steps are, as to what we can be helping and giving advice to clients.
Great. Well, thank you. In the interest of time, we probably need to switch to questions now. So thanks a lot. There's some great insight there. We've had a couple of questions on the Q&A, so let's have a look. Although the numbers are changing, do we have a high level percentage of the number of young professionals from the BPF's membership who have been placed on furlough? And do we know why it is the younger generation rather than seem to be hit the hardest? And then the second part of that was the more experienced, more expensive ? So Harvin, I don't know, I know you touched on this earlier. I don't know if you have anything to add.
In terms of the number itself of how many BPF members as a whole have been put onto furlough, I think that's in the process of being actually conducted. From the BPF Futures membership, again, similarly, that is data we're trying to collate, and hopefully we'll be able to share that with our membership in the next week monthly update that we circulate.
That was two questions combined. So I don't know if anyone else has any questions. If you do, feel free to ask them via the tool on Zoom. Okay, we've got one here. A question to Krista. You touched upon diversity, which is really crucial. Do you think furlough and the current situation generally might have an impact on D&I, such as company budgets for this, hiring of diverse candidates, etc.? How can companies come around this? That was from Priya Shah, from the founder of BAME in Property.
Hi Priya, thank you. Yeah, I think that you know, for inclusion and diversity, some companies do have budgets for those activities, and you know, for ourselves actually we've never really had big budgets for inclusion and diversity, but for us it's been about a cultural change within the organisation, which has taken quite a long time to shift and to move in terms of you know, people's understanding and acceptance, no matter where people, what protected characteristics people have. So I think as long as the company has a really strong culture and that it's part of the company business strategy to have inclusion and diversity up on the business agenda, then there shouldn't be, you know, an issue. Even if budget cuts happen, there should be a drive from people to keep that on the business agenda and keep it going. So I don't think it will stop. I think we'll just have to adapt and change the way that we are moving forward, and that will be part of companies thinking about how they adapt their business strategies moving forward.
Great, thank you.
Like, you know, groups like BAME or Real Estate Balance and others, planning out women in property, that they'll all play their role in working with employers to ensure that we adapt well in the future. Thanks,
Krista. Rachel, one for you possibly. David O'Reilly has said, thank you for that discussion. There is a lot of negative viewpoints regarding the direction of real estate and leasing going forward. Do you think there is any bright spots of opportunity in real estate in the coming years?
A big question. I mean, it's been a really challenging environment for landlords, their customers, the whole supply chain. I mean, rents have been put under pressure. Landlords have been trying to work with their landlords to work with their tenants to work through these difficult times. Many are offering a change from kind of quarterly to monthly rents to help with cash flow, perhaps deferral of rents in some cases for the tenants that are struggling most, for waiving of rents. And we're trying to support our tenants, but it's obviously, you know, a very kind of pressurized time. One of the things that we're trying to stress the need for with government is some kind of support with fixed costs, because it's not going to be sustainable for one part of the property chain, whether it be tenants or landlords or lenders, to bear the whole cost of the fallout from COVID. And so I think some support is needed for government to make sure that that everyone plays their part in bearing those costs.
Krista, we have another question for you. What are the expectations for graduates and young professionals once furlough has ended? Will there be new roles available for them? That was an anonymous question.
Well, I think, you know, the first thing to say is that furlough isn't an end to employment. So you would expect that their current position is there. Clearly, if, you know, restructuring, etc. needs to happen within business, then I'm sure that the companies will speak to individuals and consult over those changes. So I think first and foremost, the roles should be there. In terms of graduates' own expectations, you know, I would imagine that they would want to be treated well and fairly. They would want to have, you know, ensure that their job is there for them at the end of all of this. and that the industry considers the impacts more broadly and strategically on young professionals, because it is evidence that recessions do impact on young professionals and their future earnings potential a lot more than it does other areas of the business.
I think also perhaps just building on that is that while some teams may have less work on, at the same hand there are other teams who actually have been extremely busy in light of the current situation. You know, you take, for example, the business rates team. You know, there's a lot of that's under review, and they are immensely busy. So there'll be probably teams out there who will require extra support by way of perhaps new graduates, etc. So I think there are some opportunities that can come from this as well.
A really good point. Definitely. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there. If anybody had a question that hasn't been answered, our panelists have kindly offered to answer any of your questions if you just submit it via the BPF Futures LinkedIn group, which is also a good source of information, I think, for anybody that has been furloughed at the moment, and a way of keeping in touch with events such as this. So thanks to everybody that's joined, and thank you very much to the panelists for your great insight, and enjoy the rest of your day.